Part 1, 2004 to 2009. What will happen next? Scientific Romancing, 2004. I'm very honored to have been asked to give the Kesterton Lecture here at Carleton School of Journalism and Communication. I note that I am fourth in this series and that I've been preceded by three very eminent men. I've always distrusted the number 4, whereas I do have a preference for number 3. So I've broken down the dubious 4 into two sets. One of the three, a lucky moonstruck set, which includes persons of male persuasion but excludes me, and a second set of one, which includes persons of female sort and also, incidentally, me. I am therefore the first in set that I trust will number many more individuals before long. That's the feminism for this evening, which is, as you can see, I have cunningly combined with the initial fooling around so you won't have to feel so threatened by it. I've never known why people have sometimes felt threatened by me. After all, I'm quite short, and apart from Napoleon, what short person has ever been threatening? Second, I'm an icon. As you've doubtless been told, and once you're an icon, you're practically dead, and all you have to do is stand very still in parks, turning to bronze while pigeons and other perch on your shoulders and defecate on your head. Third, I'm astrologically speaking a Scorpio, one of the kindest and gentlest of the astrological signs. We like to lead quiet lives in the dark and peaceful toes of shoes, where we never give any trouble unless someone attempts to cram an aggressively large yellow toenail foot in the top of us. And so it is with me, no bother at all, unless stepped on, in which case I can't answer for the consequences. The title of my small talk tonight is Scientific Romancing. Its cover story is that it's about science fiction. Its subtext is probably what is fiction for, or something like that. The subtext under that will be a few paragraphs on the two scientific romances I myself have written, and the subtext might turn out to be what is a human being? So this lecture is like one of those round candies you could once ruin your teeth on for 2 cents, sugar coating on the outside, with descending layers of various colors until you come to an odd, indecipherable seed at the very center. First, I'll tackle the peculiar form of prose fiction often called science fiction, a label that brings together two terms you think would be mutually exclusive, since science, from scientia, means knowledge, is supposed to concern itself with demonstrable facts, and fiction, which derives from the root verb meaning to mold, as in clay, denotes a thing that is feigned or invented. With science fiction, one term is often thought to cancel out the other. The book is evaluated as something intended as a statement of truth, with the fiction part, the story, the invention, rendering it useless for anyone who really wants to get a grip on, say, nanotechnology. Or else, it's treated the way W.C. Fields treated golf when he spoke of it as a good walk spoiled. That is, the book is seen as a narrative structure cluttered up with too many esoteric geek material when it should have struck to describing the social and sexual interactions among Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice. Jules Verne, a granddaddy of science fiction on the paternal side, and the author of such works as 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, was horrified by the liberties taken by H.G. Wells, who, unlike Verne, did not confine himself to machines that were within the realm of possibility, such as a submarine, but created other machines, such as the time machine, that were quite obviously not. El invente, Jules Verne is said to have said, with vast disapproval. Thus, the note of this part of my talk I notice sometimes a nasty thing you get on your vocal cords from giving too many lectures, but I use it here in its other sense, a point of intersection. Its node is that curious locus where science and fiction meet. Where did this kind of stuff come from, and why do people write it and read it, and what's it good for anyway? Before the term science fiction appeared in America in the 1930s during the gold age of bug eyed monsters and girls and diaphanous outfits, stories such as H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds were called scientific romances. In both terms, scientific romance and science fiction, the science element is a qualifier. The nouns are romance and fiction, and the word fiction covers a lot of ground. We've fallen into the habit of calling all examples of long prose fiction novels and of judging them by standards developed by for evaluating one particular kind of long prose fiction, namely the kind that treats individuals embedded in a realistically described social milieu and which emerged with the work of Daniel Defoe, who tried to pass it off as journalism, and that of Samuel Richardson and Fanny Burney and Jane Austen during the 18th and early 19th centuries, and which was then developed by George Eliot and Charles Dickens and Flaubert and Tolstoy and many more in the mid and the late 19th century. This kind of work is found superior if it has round characters rather than flat ones. Round ones being thought to have more psychological depth. Anything that doesn't fit in this mode has been shoved into an area of lesser solemnity called genre fiction, and it is here that the spy thriller and the crime story and the adventure story and supernatural and the science fiction, however excellently written, must reside, sent to their rooms, as it were, for the misdemeanor of being enjoyable in what is considered a frivolous way. They invent, and we all know what they invent, at least up to a point, and they are therefore not about real life, which ought to lack coincidences and weirdness and action, adventure, unless it is about war, of course, and they therefore not solid. The novel proper has always laid claim to a certain kind of truth, the truth about human nature or how people really behave with all their clothes on, except in the bedroom, that is, under observable social conditions. The genres, it is thought, have other design on us. They want to entertain, a bad and escapist thing, rather than just rubbing our noses in the daily grit produced by daily grind. Unhappily for novelists, a large reading public quite likes being entertained. There's a poverty stricken writer in George Gissing's masterpiece, New Grub Street, who commits suicide after the failure of his slice of life realistic novel titled Mr. Bailey, Grocer. New Grub Street came out at the height of the craze for such adventure romance realities as Rider Haggard's She and the scientific romances of H.G. Wells and Mr. Bailey Grover. If it had been a real novel, would have had a thin time of it. If you think this can't happen now, take a look at the sales figures of Life of Pi. Pure adventure romance and the Vinci Code, ditto. And the long running Vampirmas of Anne Rice. The setting of the realistic novel proper in is Middle Earth, and the middle of the Middle Earth is the middle class. And the hero and the heroine are usually the desirable norms, or could have been in, for instance, tragic versions such as Thomas Hardy, if fate and society hadn't been so contrary. As publishers, readers say, we like these people. Grotesque variations of the desirable norms appear, of course, but they take the form not of evil talking claims or werewolves or space aliens, but of people with character defects or strange noses. Ideas about, for instance, novel and untried forms of social organizations are introduced through conversations among characters or in the form of diary or reverie, rather than being dramatized as in the utopia and the dystopia. The central characters are placed in the social space by being given parents and relatives, however unsatisfactory or dead these may be in the outset of the story. These central characters don't just appear as fully grown adults, but provided with a past, a history. This sort of fiction concerns itself with the conscious waking state, and if a man changes into an anthropod in such a book, he'll only do so only in a nightmare. But not all prose fictions are novels in this stick to realism sense of the word. A book can be prose fiction without being a novel. The Pilgrim's Progress, although a prose narrative and a fiction, was not intended as a novel. When it was written, such things were not yet exist. It's a romance, a story about the adventures of a hero, coupled with an allegory, the stages of a Christian life. It's also one of the precursors of science fiction, although not often recognized as such. Here are some other prose fiction forms that are not novel proper: the Confession, the Symposium, the Menippean Satire or Anatomy, the Utopia and its evil twin, the Dystopia. Nathaniel Hawthorne deliberately called some of his fictions romances to distinguish them from novels. What he might have been thinking of was the tendency of the romance to use a somewhat more obvious form of patterning than the novel was thought to do. The blonde heroine versus her dark alter ego. For instance, the French have two words for short stories: contes and novellas, tales and news, and that is useful distinction. The tale can be set anywhere and can be moved into realms that are off limits for the novel, into the cellars and attics of the mind, where figures that can appear in the novels only as dreams and fantasies take actual shape and walk the earth. The news, however, is news of us. It's the daily news, as in daily life. There can be car crashes and shipwrecks in the news, but there are not likely to be any Frankenstein monsters. Not that is until someone in daily life actually manages to create one. But there's more to the news than the news. Fiction can bring us another kind of news. It can speak to what is past and passing, and also of what's to come. When you're writing about what's to come, you could be engaged in journalism of dire warning sort, which used to be known as prophecy and is sometimes termed agitprop. And like that bastard, build that dam, drop that bomb, and all hell will break loose, or in its middler form, tut tut. But as a person who has all too often been asked, how did you know? I'd like to make it clear that I didn't go in for prophecy, not as such. Nobody can predict the future. There are too many variables. In the 19th century, Tennyson wrote a poem called Locksley Hall, which appeared to predict, among other things, the age of aeroplanes, and which contains the line, "For I dipped in the future, far as human eye could see." But no one can really do that. You can, however, dip into the present, which contains the seeds of what might become the future. As William Gibson has said, the future is already with us, it's just unevenly distributed. So you can look at a lamb and make an uneducated guess, such as if nothing unexpected happens to it along the way, the lamb will most likely become a sheep or your dinner. Probably excluding C, a giant wool covered monster that will crash New York. If you're writing about the future and you aren't doing the forecast journalism, you'll more likely be writing something people will either call science fiction or speculative fiction. I like to make a distinction between science fiction proper. For me, this label denotes books with things in them we can't do yet or begin to do, like going through a wormhole in the space to another universe, and speculative fiction, which employs the means already more or less to hand, such as credit cards, and takes place on planet Earth. But the terms are fluid. Some use speculative fiction as an umbrella covering science fiction and all its hybrid forms, science fiction fantasy, and so forth, and others choose the reverse. Here are some of the things that these kind of narratives can do that novels, as usually defined, cannot do. They can explore the consequences of new and proposed technology in graphic ways by showing them as fully operational. They can explore the nature and limits of what it means to be a human in graphic ways by pushing the envelope as far as it will go. They can explore the relationship of man to the universe, an exploration that often takes us in the direction of religion and can meld easily with mythology. Again, an exploration that can happen within the conventions of realism only through conversations, reveries, and soliloquies. They can explore proposed changes in social organizations by showing what they might be like for those living within them if we actually did them. Thus, the utopia and the dystopia. They can explore the realms of the imagination by taking us boldly where no man has ever gone before. Thus, the spaceship, the inner space of the Fantastic Voyage, the cyberspace strips of William Gibson and the Matrix. This last, by the way, an adventure romance with strong overtones of Christian allegory and thus more closely related to the Pilgrim's progress than to Pride and Prejudice. More than one commentator has mentioned that science fiction as a form is where theological narrative went after Paradise Lost, and that is undoubtedly true. Supernatural creatures with wings and burning bushes that speak are unlikely to encounter in a novel about stockbrokers, unless the stockbrokers have been taking quite a few mind altering substances, but they are not out of place on Planet X. I myself have written two works of science fiction, or you prefer speculative fiction, The Handmaid's Tale and Oryx and Crake. Although lumped together by commentators who have spotted those things they have in common, they are not novels in the Jane Austen sense, and both are set in future. They are, in fact, dissimilar. The Handmaid's Tale is a classic dystopia which takes at least of its inspiration from George Orwell's 1984, particularly the epilogue. In the BBC piece I did in June 2003 on the occasion of Orwell's centenary birthday, I said, Orwell has been accused of bitterness and pessimism, of leaving us with a vision of future which the individual has no chance, and where the brutal, totalitarian boot of the all-controlling party will grind into the human face forever. But this view of Orwell is contradicted by the last chapter of the book, an essay on newspeak, a doublethink language connected by regime. By expurgating all the words that might be troublesome, bad is no longer permitted, but becomes double plus ungood. And by making other words mean the opposite of what they used to mean, the place where people get tortured is the Ministry of Love. The building where the pastor destroyed is the Ministry of Information, and the rulers of Airship One wish to make it literally impossible for people to think straight. However, the essay on Newspeak is written in standard English in third person and in the past tense, which can only mean that the regime has fallen, and the language and the individuality have survived. For whoever has written the essay on Newspeak, the world of 1984 is over. Thus, it's my view that Orwell had much more faith in the resilience of human spirit that he's usually been given credit for. Orwell became a direct model for me much later in my life, in the real 1984, the year which I began writing a somewhat different dystopia, The Handmaid's Tale. The majority of dystopias have been written by men, and the point of view has been male. When women have appeared in them, they have been either sexless automatons or rebels who've defied the sex rules of Edge regime. They've acted as a tempress of the male protagonists, however, welcome this temptation may be to the men themselves. Julia of 1984, Lenina, the cami knicker wearing Orgy Porgy seducer, the savage in the Brave New World, 12330, the subversive femme fatale of Yevgeny Zamyatin's 1924 seminal classic We. I wanted to try a dystopia from the female point of view, a world according to Julia, as it were. However, this does not make The Handmaid's Tale a feminist dystopia, except insofar as giving a woman a voice and an inner life will always be considered feminist by those who think women ought not to have these things. In other respects, the despotism I describe is the same as all real ones and most imagined ones. It has a small, powerful group at the top that controls or tries to control everyone else, and gets the lion's share of available goodies. The pig and animal farm get the milk and the apples, the elite of the handmaid's tale get the fertile women. The force that opposes the tyranny in my book is the one in which Orwell himself, despite his belief in the need for political organization to combat oppression, always puts greater store. Ordinary human decency, of the kind he praised in his essay on Charles Dickens. At the end of The Handmaid's Tale, there's a section that owes much to 1984. It's the account of a symposium held several hundred years in the future, in which the repressive government described in the novel is now merely a subject for academic analysis. The parallels with Orwell's essay on Newspeak should be evident. In Handmaid's Tale, then, is a dystopia. What about Oryx and Crake? I would argue that it is not a classic dystopia. Though it has dystopian elements, we don't really get an overview of the structure of the society in it. Instead, we see its central characters living their lives with the small corners of that society. What they can grasp of the rest of the world comes to them through television and the internet, and is thus suspect because edited. I'd say instead that Oryx and Crake is an adventure romance coupled with a Menippean satire, the literary form that deals in intellectual obsession. The Laputa or floating island proportion of the Gulliver's Travels is one of these. So are the Watson Crick Institute chapters of Oryx and Crake. The fact that Laputa never did and never could exist, though Swift put his fingers correctly on the advantage of air superiority, but the Watson Crick Institute is very close to being a reality, doesn't have much to do with their functions within the literary form. In Oryx and Crake, there are some people who have been designed, and they have been designed as an improvement on the current model, ourselves. Anyone who engages in such design and designing people is very close to being something we can't really do now. Such a designer has to ask, how far can you go in the alteration department? What features are at the core of our being? What is it to be human? What a piece of work is man? And now that we are ourselves can be workmen, what bits should be chopped off? Which brings me back to the note I mentioned earlier, the point of intersection between science and fiction. Are you against science? I'm sometimes asked. What a curious question. Against science as opposed to what? And in favor of what? Without that thing we call science, a lot of us would be dead of smallpox, not to mention tuberculosis. I grew up among scientists. I know their ways. I almost became a scientist myself and would have done so had I not been kidnapped by literature. Some of my best relatives are scientists. They're not all like Dr. Frankenstein, but science, as I've said, is about knowledge. Fiction, on the other hand, is about feeling. Science, as such, is not a person and doesn't have a system of morality built into it, and any more than a toaster does. It is only a tool for actualizing what we desire and defending against what we fear. And like any other tool, it can be used for good or ill. You can build a house with a hammer, and you can use the same hammer to murder your neighbor. Human tool makers always make tools that will help us get what we want, and what we want hasn't changed for thousands of years because, as far as we can tell, human nature hasn't changed either. How do we know? We know if we consult the myths and stories. They tell us how and what we feel, and how and what we feel determines what we want. What do we want? Here's a partial list. We want the purse that will always be filled with gold. We want the fountain of youth. We want to fly. We want the table that will cover itself with delicious food whenever we say the word and that will clean up afterwards. We want invisible servants we'll never have to pay. We want the 7 league boots so we can get places very quickly. We want the cloak of invisibility so we can snoop on other people without being seen. We want the weapon that will never miss and that will destroy our enemies utterly. We want to punish injustice. We want power. We want excitement and adventure. We want safety and security. We want to be immortal. We want to have a large number of sexually attractive partners. We want those we love to love us in return and to be loyal to us. We want cute, smart children who will treat us with respect we deserve and who will not smash up the car. We want to be surrounded by music and by ravishing scents and attractive visual objects. We don't want to be too hot. We don't want to be too cold. We want to dance. We want to drink a lot without having a hangover. We want to speak with the animals. We want to be envied. We want to be as gods. We want wisdom. We want hope. We want to be good. Therefore, we sometimes tell ourselves stories that deal with the darker sides of all of our other wants. And educational systems that teaches us only about our tools and how to of them, their creation, their maintenance, and not about their function as facilitators of our desire, is in essence no more than a school of toaster repair. You can be the best toaster repair person in the world, but you will cease to have a job if a toast is no longer a desirable food item on the human breakfast menu. The arts, as we have come to term them, are not a frill. They are the heart of the matter because they are about our hearts, and our technological inventiveness is generated by our emotions, not just by our minds. A society without the arts would have broken its mirror and cut out its heart. It would no longer be what we recognize as human. As William Blake noted long ago, the human imagination drives the world. At first, it drove only the human world, which was once very small in comparison to the huge and powerful nature world around to it. Now we are next door to being in control of everything except the weather, but it's still the human imagination. It lets the shadowy forms of thought and feeling, heaven, hell, monsters, angels, and all, out into the light, where we can take a good look at them and perhaps come to a better understanding of who we are and what we want, and what our limits to those wants may be. Understanding the imagination is no longer a pastime or even a duty, but a necessity, because increasingly, if we can imagine it, we'll be able to do it, or we'll be able to try it at least. We've always been good at letting the cats out of the bags and genies out of the bottles and the plagues out of the Pandora's box. We just haven't been very good at putting them back in again. But we're children of narrative, every one of us. Perhaps what impels us forward, and yes, gets us out of the bed and downstairs to reading the morning paper, is that simple question every writer of fiction and every journalist You notice I make the distinction, has to deal with every writing hour. That question is, what will happen next?